She never thought she'd be the one to prove them wrong. It started like any other routine day at the airport. Shannon Williams, dressed in a Navy SEAL uniform, stepped off her flight, exhausted but ready to tackle another mission. She was used to the stares, the whispers, the occasional sideways glance. She knew how it felt to be judged before even speaking, but today felt different. As she made her way through security, Shannon could feel eyes following her, scanning her from head to toe. She had learned long ago to brush it off, but there was something in the air today, something heavier than usual. The soft buzz of the terminal was interrupted by the sharp sound of footsteps behind her. She turned slightly to see a security officer approach, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. "Excuse me, ma'am, could you come with me?" The words were polite, but there was an unmistakable edge to them. Shannon's stomach tightened. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood still, meeting his gaze with quiet confidence. She had nothing to hide. The officer's hand hovered near his radio. He spoke again, this time with more authority. "We need to question you about something." Shannon felt a pang of unease, but still, she didn't flinch. "What's the issue?" she asked, her voice calm, but her mind racing. The officer hesitated for a moment, his lips curling into a tight smile as he glanced down at her uniform. "You're not exactly who you claim to be," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. The statement stung, but Shannon didn't show it. She had heard it all before. "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied, keeping her voice steady. But the officer wasn't done. "You've been flagged," he muttered under his breath, "and we're going to need to take you in." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Shannon could feel the weight of the situation settling over her. The eyes of the surrounding passengers were now fixed on her, some with pity, others with judgment. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This was injustice dressed in a uniform. She followed the officer quietly, not because she was scared, but because she knew the truth was on her side. As they approached the security checkpoint, Shannon's mind raced. Why was she being singled out? Was it because of her uniform? Was it because of her skin? She had no answers, just a quiet determination to stay composed. They reached a small office near the back of the terminal, where the officer's partner stood waiting. They exchanged a look before the officer spoke again. "Please have a seat." Shannon's heart beat a little faster as she stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a soft click, sealing her into a room filled with uncertainty. It was the first time in a long while that she felt truly vulnerable. She wasn't worried about the outcome. She knew she was in the right. But the thought of being judged based on assumptions, based on her appearance, was unsettling. She took a deep breath and sat down, her back straight and her eyes never leaving the officer. She wasn't about to let them break her, and she certainly wasn't about to let them take away her dignity. The seconds ticked by slowly, each one adding to the tension that had already settled into Shannon's chest. The small office, dimly lit and cold, felt like it was closing in on her. She sat upright in the chair, her fingers tightly gripping the edges of her uniform. Her mind raced as she scanned the room, taking in every detail. There was nothing here that suggested she was anything but what she claimed to be. But that wasn't the problem, was it? The problem was that she was a black woman in a Navy SEAL uniform, and that made her an easy target for suspicion. The officer who had escorted her in was still standing by the door, his posture stiff and tense. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken judgments. Finally, the second officer spoke up, breaking the stillness. "We need to confirm your identity, ma'am. It's standard procedure." Shannon nodded, keeping her emotions in check. She understood the need for verification, but the way they were treating her, it felt wrong. As the officer left the room to make the call, Shannon's thoughts drifted back to the years of training that had gotten her to this point. She wasn't just a woman in a uniform. She was a trained operative, someone who had been through hell and back to protect her country. She wasn't about to let a misunderstanding in an airport terminal define her. She had seen far worse in her career: hostile territories, enemy forces, life-and-death situations. But this felt different. She could hear the faint murmur of voices in the hallway outside the office. It seemed like the entire airport was talking about her. "Did you hear? She's with the Navy SEALs. I heard she was a fraud, that she didn't belong in that uniform." Shannon closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had heard it all before. The whispers, the judgments. She wasn't the first to face suspicion because of her race. but she would be the last to back down. When the door opened again, Shannon stood without hesitation, her movements deliberate and controlled. The officer returned, now accompanied by a man in a suit. The man looked vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place him. He wasn't in uniform, but the way he carried himself, there was no mistaking that he was someone important. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice calm but commanding. "No, sir," the first officer replied, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "We're just verifying her identity." The man glanced at Shannon, his gaze sharp but neutral. "Ma'am, may I see your identification?" Shannon didn't flinch. She had nothing to hide. She handed over her military ID, the seal of the Navy clearly visible. The man took it, inspecting it closely. "Is this your ID, officer?" he asked the first officer, who nodded, though the uncertainty was still palpable. The man nodded slowly, as if weighing something in his mind. "This is quite an unusual situation," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Shannon's patience was running thin. "I've given you everything you need," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here on a mission. I need to be on my way." The man finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You understand, ma'am? This is a matter of security," he said. "We just can't take any chances." Shannon's mind raced again. Security? Or was it something more? The officer's reluctance to trust her wasn't about procedure. It was about something deeper, something rooted in bias. "I understand," Shannon replied, her tone calm but firm. "But you also need to understand that I'm not going anywhere until I've been cleared." The man paused, looking at the first officer, who seemed unsure of how to proceed. "Clear her," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Now." The officer hesitated, but after a long moment, he nodded and left the room, returning shortly after with confirmation. Shannon exhaled slowly. It was over, at least for now. But as she walked out of the room, she knew this wouldn't be the last time she'd face suspicion. Not as a woman in uniform, and not as a black woman. Shannon walked out of the small office with her head held high, the weight of the situation lifting off her shoulders. She had been cleared, but the tension was far from over. As she stepped into the bustling terminal, the familiar hum of the airport felt oddly distant. People walked past, unaware of the small storm that had just erupted in the back offices, but Shannon couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. She had been on countless missions, faced more life-threatening situations than she could count. But this was different. The quiet stares, the whispered conversations, and the way the officers had treated her. It was a stark reminder of how people like her were often seen, especially in places of authority. As she made her way toward the gate, Shannon's mind drifted to the events of the past few hours. She had known the uniform would bring attention, but she never expected it to bring suspicion, or worse, disdain. She had hoped the world had moved past that, but it seemed like prejudice was still alive and well, hiding behind uniforms, behind badges, behind assumptions. Shannon paused by a window, looking out at the planes lined up on the tarmac, the bright blue sky stretching out in front of her. For a moment, everything felt normal again. The world was still turning, the planes were still flying, and her mission was still intact. But then, her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the moment of calm. It was a text from her superior, brief but clear. "We need to talk. Now." Shannon felt a tightness in her chest as she read the message. She knew this wasn't just about the incident at the airport. There was something else, something more serious that needed her attention. She stepped into the restroom to take a moment before responding. The mirror reflected her face, but it was hard to recognize the woman staring back at her. She had always prided herself on being able to remain calm in any situation, but today was different. She was still the same Shannon Williams, a Navy SEAL, a woman of strength and resilience. But the events at the airport had shaken something deep inside her. It wasn't just the disrespect or the prejudice. It was the realization that no matter what she achieved, no matter how much she gave, there would always be people who saw her as less. As she left the restroom, Shannon's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. She answered it without hesitation. "Shannon." Her superior's voice crackled over the line. "We have a situation. It's not just about what happened at the airport. It's bigger than that. We need you to come in, now." Her heart skipped a beat. The weight of the words hit her like a ton of bricks. She had faced down terrorists, criminals, and the worst humanity had to offer, but nothing had prepared her for this. She was needed, not just for her skills as a Navy SEAL, but because the truth was finally being uncovered. "I'll be there in 10, she replied, her voice steady but filled with determination. As she made her way toward the exit, Shannon couldn't help but think about the people who had doubted her, who had judged her before they even knew her. This was far from over. It was just the beginning, and she was ready to face whatever came next, with the same strength and resolve she had always carried. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. It was time to take a stand. Shannon walked out of the office, her mind still processing the conversation with Captain Carter. The weight of the mission ahead of her was heavy, but it was also clear. She had always known that corruption ran deep in some places, but this was different. As she made her way back to her apartment, the city streets seemed to blur in the background. Her thoughts were racing, trying to piece together the information she had just been given. She had been trained for countless missions, faced down life-threatening situations, and yet, none of those had prepared her for this. The mission wasn't just about gathering intel. It was about exposing something that had been hidden for far too long. She needed to move carefully, remain invisible, and gain the trust of people who had spent years hiding their tracks. It wasn't just the criminals she had to worry about. It was the entire system that had enabled them. She thought back to the airport incident, to the way the officers had treated her. It wasn't just a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was a reflection of something much deeper. The suspicion, the judgment, the assumption that she didn't belong. That feeling of being seen as other wasn't something she could easily forget. It had ignited a fire in her that would not go out until the truth was brought to light. As Shannon entered her apartment, she took a deep breath and set down her bag. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. She needed to prepare, both mentally and physically. The next phase of the operation would require her to be more than just a Navy SEAL. It would require her to be patient, observant, and strategic. She began to go over the details in her head. She would need to meet with a few key individuals, people who were well connected to the network she had to infiltrate. These were people who lived in the shadows, moving in and out of the system without ever being noticed. But she knew they had weaknesses. They were arrogant. They underestimated the people they thought they could control. And that was where she would find her opening. She made a list, checking off the names she had memorized. She had no room for mistakes. Everything had to be precise. Shannon paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the room. It felt oddly peaceful, almost like the calm before a storm. She knew that once she stepped back into the field, there would be no turning back. The stakes were higher now. She wasn't just working to protect her country. She was working to restore the integrity of an entire system. She couldn't do it alone, but with the right information, the right moves, and a little bit of luck, she could expose the rot that had been festering for so long. Shannon stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The lights from the streets below flickered in the distance, a quiet reminder of the world she was about to face. She wasn't afraid. She had seen worse. What she was afraid of, though, was that the system that was supposed to protect people like her had failed, that the very institutions she had sworn to protect had become corrupted from the inside out. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. Shannon wasn't just a Navy SEAL. She was someone who knew how to fight, how to survive, and most importantly, how to bring justice to those who thought they were untouchable. As the city bustled beneath her, Shannon took one last breath, her resolve firming. She was ready. The next morning, Shannon sat in her car, parked a few blocks away from the downtown coffee shop where she had arranged to meet a contact. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, her mind focused on the task ahead. The streets were calm, almost eerily quiet for a city that never seemed to stop moving. Shannon had spent the night reviewing every detail of her mission, making sure there were no gaps, no room for error. She had already made contact with a low-level officer, someone who was on the fringe of the network she was trying to infiltrate. This officer, Marcus, was someone who had a reputation for knowing things that weren't in the official reports, things that could expose the corruption running deep within the system. She had spent hours tracking his movements, learning his habits, waiting for the right moment to approach him without raising suspicion. Today was that moment. Marcus was her entry point into the world she needed to navigate, the world of power, influence, and corruption. But she couldn't afford to let him know who she really was. She had to keep her cover, play the part of someone who was just another law enforcement officer trying to climb the ranks. It was a role she had played many times before, but never under such high stakes. She checked her watch, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. The coffee shop was only a short walk away, but every step felt heavier than the last. She had to be careful. Marcus was known to be wary of anyone who asked too many questions. She wasn't just walking into a meeting. She was walking into the heart of the storm. As she pushed open the door to the coffee shop, the bell above it chimed softly. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension in Shannon's chest. She scanned the room quickly, her eyes landing on Marcus sitting at a corner table, his back to the window. He looked up as she approached, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "You're on time," he said, his voice low. Shannon slid into the chair across from him, offering a small smile. "I try to be. I hate waiting." Marcus chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, in this line of work, patience is something you learn." Shannon nodded, her mind racing. She had to make this conversation count. There was no room for mistakes. "So, what's the deal?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "I know you've been looking into some things, Marcus. Things that could be useful." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're not the first person to come to me with that kind of talk." Shannon raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. "But you're still talking to me. Why's that?" Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "Because you're persistent, and you've got a reason for being here. People like you don't just show up for no reason. They've got a plan." Shannon stayed calm, meeting his gaze. "I do have a plan, and I think you could help me with it." He studied her for a moment, then leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "What's in it for me?" Shannon hesitated just long enough to make sure he knew she was thinking carefully about her response. "I can offer you protection," she said, her voice steady. "I can help you get out of this mess you're in." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You know a lot. More than you're letting on." Shannon smiled, though it didn't feel like a victory. "I've been paying attention. You might want to start doing the same." There was a long pause, and then Marcus nodded. "All right," he said, his voice still low. "But this isn't something I can just hand over. You'll have to prove you're not just another cop looking to take me down." Shannon's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "I can prove it, but it's going to take time." He leaned back again, studying her. "We'll see." Shannon's mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the next steps. She had just gained Marcus's trust, but it was only the beginning. The harder part was still ahead of her. The corruption she was fighting against ran deeper than she had realized, and now, with Marcus in the mix, she had a foot in the door. But she couldn't let her guard down. Not yet. Not when the stakes were this high. As she sat there, across from Marcus, the weight of the mission settled in her chest again. There was no turning back now. The game had begun, and Shannon was ready to play. Shannon left the coffee shop with a new sense of urgency. The meeting with Marcus had gone as well as she could have hoped, but it also revealed how much deeper the problem went. She wasn't just dealing with a few bad apples. She was up against an entire system that had been compromised. As she walked through the streets of the city, her thoughts were sharp, focused. She had the information she needed to move forward, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Marcus had given her a list of names, officers, politicians, people who were all part of the same corrupt network. Some of the names were familiar, others were new. She knew that if she could connect the dots, it would bring everything crashing down. But the pieces were scattered, and she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The weight of what she had to do was starting to sink in. She had always known that the work she did was important, but this felt different. She wasn't just protecting her country anymore. She was fighting to restore integrity, to show that there were still people out there who believed in justice. It was a fight she couldn't back down from. By the time Shannon got to her apartment, the sun had begun to set, casting a soft golden light over the city. She stood in front of her door for a moment, taking a deep breath. It was time to start making calls, to reach out to the right people. The information Marcus had provided was just the beginning. She had to go deeper, find the connections, and gather the proof she needed. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Captain Carter. "We need to meet. It's urgent." Shannon's heart skipped a beat. She quickly typed a reply. "I'm on my way." She didn't waste any time. She grabbed her keys and headed back out the door, her mind focused on what was ahead. The drive to the meeting spot was quiet. but Shannon couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The city outside her car window seemed like a different world, one that she was no longer a part of. She had stepped into a world of shadows, a world where nothing was as it seemed. The traffic lights blinked red as she reached the intersection, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. She knew that meeting with Captain Carter meant that things were moving forward, but what did that mean for her? What kind of danger was she about to face? When she arrived at the meeting location, a small, quiet diner on the edge of town, she parked and got out of the car. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that whatever it was going to be big. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The diner was empty except for Captain Carter, who was sitting at a booth in the back. Shannon walked over and slid into the seat across from her. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice low. Captain Carter looked up, her expression serious. "It's worse than we thought," she said, leaning forward. "We've got evidence of a larger operation, one that goes all the way to the top. We've been tracking it for weeks, but we need you to help us bring it down." Shannon nodded. "How do we do that?" Captain Carter handed her a folder. "We've got a team in place, but we need someone with your experience on the inside. You're the only one who can get close enough to pull this off." Shannon opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. It was all starting to make sense now. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But the risk was enormous. "This isn't going to be easy," Shannon said, her eyes meeting Captain Carter's. "I know," Captain Carter replied, her voice steady. "But we don't have a choice. The system is broken, and if we don't fix it, no one will." Shannon took a deep breath, her mind racing. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but it also felt like the moment when everything could fall apart. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. Shannon sat at the dimly lit table, the folder in front of her like an anchor, the weight of the documents inside settling in her chest. Captain Carter's words echoed in her mind. "The system is broken, and if we don't fix it, no one will." Those words had been haunting her ever since. She had always been proud to serve, to uphold the values she believed in. But now, she wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting to save a system that had become corrupt at its core, and the realization weighed heavily on her. The meeting had been brief, but Captain Carter's trust in her had been clear. She needed to infiltrate the inner circle, become part of the network, and uncover the truth. But the risks were higher now. If she made one wrong move, everything would fall apart. She glanced at the documents in front of her, her eyes scanning through the names, the connections, the patterns that were beginning to emerge. The officers involved weren't just isolated cases. This was a network, an organized system of power and influence, one that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the police department. As she read, she couldn't help but think about the people who had trusted her, who had always believed in her ability to do what was right. They had no idea what was happening beneath the surface. No idea that the very system they relied on was being manipulated by those they had sworn to trust. But Shannon couldn't focus on that now. She had a mission. She had to stay focused. The phone on the table buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus. "We need to meet. Same place as last time. Urgent." Shannon felt a flash of unease. She had expected this, but the timing still felt off. She grabbed her coat and left the apartment, the chill of the evening air biting at her skin. The city felt different tonight, quieter, more distant. As she made her way to the meeting point, Shannon couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling. The information Marcus had shared was invaluable, but the more she uncovered, the more dangerous it became. She was getting too close. The meeting spot was the same small coffee shop where they had met before. When Shannon arrived, Marcus was already there, sitting at a corner table, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting trouble. She took a deep breath before walking over and sitting across from him. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with anticipation. Marcus didn't waste any time. He slid a small envelope across the table toward her. "This is it. The final piece," he said. "Everything you need to take them down." Shannon picked up the envelope, her hands steady despite the growing tension in her chest. She opened it carefully, pulling out a set of documents. As she scanned the pages, her eyes widened. The names, the dates, the connections, it was all there. She had what she needed to bring everything to light. But with it came a sense of finality. There was no going back now. "You were right," Marcus said, his voice low. This goes higher than we thought. We've got one shot at this. If we fail, it's over for both of us. Shannon nodded, her jaw set with determination. We won't fail. Not this time. She slid the documents back into the envelope and stood up. I'll take it from here. I'll contact you when it's done. As Shannon walked out of the coffee shop, her mind raced. She had everything she needed, but the clock was ticking. She had one chance to expose the truth and dismantle the corruption from the inside. Every decision from here on out would be crucial. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. The mission had just become even more dangerous. But Shannon was ready. She had always been ready. Now, it was time to finish what she had started. Shannon sat in her car, the weight of the documents heavy in her hands, the envelope still closed but brimming with information. She had the proof she needed, but now came the hardest part, taking down the network. Her mind raced as she drove through the quiet city streets, the headlights of her car cutting through the darkness. It had been a long day, but Shannon knew that the real work was just beginning. She had a plan, but the steps ahead would require precision. There was no room for mistakes. She needed to be one step ahead of everyone, especially those who were already watching her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled over, taking a deep breath before reading the message. It was from Captain Carter. The clock is ticking. We move tomorrow. Be ready. Shannon exhaled slowly, the reality of the situation hitting her. Tomorrow would be the day she would expose everything, the corruption, the lies, the system that had failed so many. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. She had the information to change everything, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. There were still people in powerful positions who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But she wasn't going to back down. She had come too far. The next morning, Shannon arrived at the safe house where she and the team would meet. It was a small, nondescript building on the edge of the city, tucked away from prying eyes. Inside, Captain Carter was already waiting, a map of the city spread out on the table in front of her. We're going in, Carter said without preamble. We've got the green light. This ends today. Shannon nodded, her focus clear. She wasn't here to waste time. She wasn't here to play games. What's the plan? She asked, her voice steady. Carter looked up, meeting her gaze. We hit their operations at the same time. You'll be on the inside, getting the intel we need. The rest of us will move in on the outside, cutting off any escape routes. It's going to be fast, precise, and clean. Shannon's eyes scanned the map. And the names. The ones we've identified. Carter's expression hardened. We've got a list of key players. They're going down today. Shannon took a deep breath. She had been ready for this moment for a long time. But now, with the reality of it all sinking in, she couldn't ignore the risk. We can't afford to fail, she said quietly. Carter gave her a sharp nod. Failure is not an option. The tension in the room was palpable, but Shannon didn't flinch. She knew what had to be done. She had trained for this, fought for this. And now, she would see it through. The next few hours were a blur of preparations. Gearing up, coordinating with the team, making sure everyone knew their role. As they prepared to move, Shannon couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had worked for had led to this moment. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was real. But she had come this far. She wouldn't stop now. When the time came, Shannon moved swiftly and silently, slipping into the shadows as she had been trained to do. Every move was calculated, every step precise. She knew she couldn't let her guard down, not even for a second. The operation was underway, and the clock was ticking. Every second counted. As Shannon approached the target, her heart raced, but she kept her breathing steady. She was ready. She had the evidence, she had the plan, and now, she would take down the network that had corrupted everything she had worked to protect. The mission was in motion, and Shannon was determined to see it through, no matter the cost.